What up, cucks? It's your boy, the hater, up in this piece. And I have some free time, so I figured I'd do a video that's been on my mind recently. The truth is that both WWE and AEW suck, right? Now, because we have quote unquote two wrestling companies, even though AEW is really an indie fed, but let's just say we have two wrestling companies, it becomes almost paramount to compare them to each other, right? And that is a problem in and of itself, right? A lot of people, the general convention is that people think that when there is competition, that's good. And that's true sometimes, right? But it's not always true. Because competition can also make you complacent, right? If you beat your competition like WWE has obviously beaten AEW, it's fucking over, right? Then it's basically like you don't have any competition, so you get complacent, right? The truth is, you need successful competition. And one way that we can channel successful competition is by looking at the past, right? Which is what I was trying to do with my WrestleMania 15 review, right? A lot of the people in the comments understood, right? They got the idea. The idea is that WrestleMania 15 told a story from beginning to the end. Not everything was critical to the story. There was filler, like there is in almost any story, but a story was told. It wasn't a series of divided matches that could easily have happened on Raw or SmackDown. When I and many other people say this match could have happened on Raw or SmackDown, we're not saying only that the match is garbage, right? I mean, of course, that's the main point, right? But we're saying that it didn't need to happen at WrestleMania, right? WrestleMania is supposed to be a big deal. It's supposed to be a huge honor to be in WrestleMania, right? The showcase of the immortals. Not the showcase of Austin Theory, right? He's not an immortal, he's a jobber, so nobody cares, right? Now, this brings me to my next point, right? And I'll use Austin Theory as an example, right? The names of wrestlers have gone to the lowest point they've ever been. Now, I know you're thinking, hater, who cares about the names of wrestlers? Well, the wrestlers should care about the names of wrestlers. I was watching this mini documentary many years ago where Stone Cold was talking, and it was a documentary about Stone Cold and how he became Stone Cold, more or less, right? And Stone Cold tells a story how he saw some serial killer on TV, and this guy was just like a cold-looking dude, and Stone Cold wanted to kind of base his character on that, on the premise that he's a cold-hearted man, right? So he went to Vince and to Creative, and he said, all right, that's what I want, right? And Creative started coming up with names for him, right? And one of the names that I remember was Otto Van Frost, right? And Stone Cold's like, that's fucking stupid. I'm not going to be Otto Van Frost. That's a dumb name, right? And this was bugging him a lot, according to the documentary. And he's hanging out with his wife, who was some English woman at the time, right? She makes him a tea, and she's like, Steve, have your tea before it goes stone cold, which apparently is like a saying in England, right? And he's like, that's it. Stone Cold Steve Austin. Now, why is this important, right? It's not just important because Stone Cold Steve Austin ended up being the biggest wrestling star in the Attitude Era and arguably of all time. It's important because the name is critical to this, right? If I were to tell you, let's say you didn't know who Stone Cold was. Let's say you didn't know who any of the people that I'm going to mention were, right? If I were to tell you, like tomorrow night on SmackDown or something, right? We're going to have a match and it's going to be between Jim Smith and Steve McDonald, right? You'd be like, okay, I don't give a flying fuck, right? I don't care if Jim Smith beats Steve McDonald, right? Who cares, right? It's just the names of two random guys. Likewise, if you didn't know who the people were, right? You just didn't know at all. And you just read on a card. You're like, oh, Sammy Guevara versus Kip Sabian. You'd be like, oh, okay, I don't care at all because it's just, again, two guys that you can be friends with. Hi, I'm Sammy. Hi, I'm Kip. These are normal people names, right? Now, again, I'd like for everyone to try to remove their knowledge before they can understand the point, right? Let's say you didn't know who Undertaker and Kane were, and I said, tomorrow night there's going to be a wrestling match. Oh, who's wrestling? Well, it's The Undertaker versus Kane, right? Automatically, you'd be like, that's a little interesting, right? Certainly, it's more interesting than Kip Sabian versus Sammy Guevara, right? Which could be just a guy who fixes air conditioning and an accountant, right? It's just two random people, just like, it could be two lawyers, right? It could be two anybody's. But The Undertaker is never going to be a lawyer or a doctor. The Undertaker is obviously some sort of character, right? Likewise, if I were to tell you it's going to be Hulk Hogan versus the Ultimate Warrior, you'd be like, oh shit, that sounds compelling immediately, right? A few people have done this in the past. They've played around with their names to essentially give themselves a gimmick, more or less, right? Muhammad Ali is arguably the first. He changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. Now, I know he didn't do it to put himself over as a boxer, but he definitely understood that it was going to have that effect, right? He became a character in the ring after he changed his name, right? Cassius Clay is a different person than Muhammad Ali, right? I'm not saying one's the real one, was the fake one. I'm not saying it's a gimmick, right? But it was a different character. Conor McGregor is another example who plays a character, right? But in real sports, you can't change your name, right? Because, it's a real sport. But we see that happening with clever nicknames, or even some people like that are billed under their nickname, right? So, for example, there's a UFC fighter. I don't even know his real name, but his UFC name is the Korean Zombie, right? Now, if you are hearing that the Korean Zombie is fighting anybody, right? You're like, oh, I'd like to tune in to see what the fuck the Korean Zombie is, right? You see what I'm saying? If it's a good name, you are going to tune in. Likewise, if it's a bad name, you're not going to tune in. So if someone says this week it's Orange Cassidy versus Luchasaurus, you're going to be like, oh, okay, I think I'll start watching next week because I have no interest in a guy named Orange Cassidy, right? Now, Orange Cassidy and Luchasaurus are both attempts at creating a character through a name and as well as other elements, right? But the importance of the name cannot be understated. And the reason why I bring this up is because nowadays, for again, there's some exceptions, right? But largely, there are no creative names in WWE, and the ones that are creative are bad names. Like Ricochet, for example, is creative because the idea is he's bouncing around, all over the place, right? But the problem is, number one, it's the main character of a show called Mucha Lucha, which was a TV show. So every time I hear Ricochet, I think of Mucha Lucha, which I didn't even watch. I just knew that, basically the character in Mucha Lucha was basically like Rey Mysterio, right? He was a little kid, Rey Mysterio, who wants to be like, a luchador. And his name was Ricochet, right? So this was pretty fun for children, I'm sure. I was a little too old to watch this, but that's all I think about. So you need to have good names. And WWE doesn't do this, right? They will literally just hire someone. They'll change their name from a boring name to another boring name, right? So we had, Cruz del Toro right now from LWO. He was something else. I forget. Raul Mendoza. That's what he was. Raul Mendoza. They took Raul Mendoza, not good enough. We're going to now name him Cruz del Toro. So what, right? Who cares? Who cares if you've renamed him from, Cruz del Toro, from Raul Mendoza to Cruz del Toro, right? And the same can be said about any different gimmick change, right? A lot of people got angry when Walter was rebranded as Gunther, right? Obviously, everyone got over it, but the idea is Gunther is a better name than Walter. That goes without saying. But it's not a compelling name, right? Now, a lot of times the name doesn't even have to make sense. It just has to be compelling. And they don't all have to be fake names like The Undertaker or Kane, right? But you're not going to present the wrestling character of Kane under his real name, which is Glenn Jacobs, right? Which sounds, strangely enough, like a fucking mayor, because that's what he is, right? Like, it sounds like a mayor. I don't want to see the mayor fight the gardener. You know what I mean? I want to see, the demon fight the Ultimate Warrior, right? That's what we want to see. We want to see crazy shit. And that there's a reason for that. It's not a coincidence that The Rock only got over when he became The Rock, and Stone Cold only got over when he became Stone Cold, right? It's not the gimmick. The gimmick was largely the same, right? Of course, The Rock became more animated, and he became more sarcastic and more comedic. But just the name change itself, right, was a step in the right direction. Name changes, just like gimmick changes, are super important. I'll give you another example. One of my personal favorites, right? So we had a guy in WCW called Shane Helms, right? Shane Helms is just like a generic name. That could be anybody's name, right? Nobody cares about Shane Helms. So he eventually gets signed by WWE during the Invasion thing, and he becomes Hurricane Helms, which then becomes just the Hurricane, right? Then the Hurricane, you're like, oh, that's interesting. What is that? And you see it, you're like, oh, I get it. He thinks he's a superhero. That's kind of clever, right? Eventually, he rebrands as Gregory Helms, right? Now, even the difference between Shane Helms and Gregory Helms is significant, right? This is where the nuance starts to run through, right? So Shane Helms just sounds like a guy in a boy band because that was his gimmick. He was a guy in a boy band. Gregory Helms, it's not Greg Helms, it's Gregory Helms, right? That sounds like a serious man. And that was his character, that he was now becoming serious. More importantly, of course, is the fact that he went from being Hurricane or the Hurricane to Gregory Helms, right? The name change was crucial to him changing his character, and then he got over, and he was, he got injured eventually, but his star was shining bright during that time. Now, WWE and AEW both suck because when they introduce a new character, they legit will just give them sometimes even one name, like Miro, right? Like, what would be the difference if his name was Miro versus if it was, I don't know, Austin or Matthew, right? It would make no difference. Now, I'm not saying he should be named Matthew or Austin, obviously. I'm saying, how about you give him a name that's either badass, right? Or a name that's a fake name that's going to get this guy over. Because he's not going to get over by himself, as we've seen time and time again, right? So the idea is, in order to get someone over, a lot of times you have to change their name. There are exceptions, of course, right? Kurt Angle got over, right? But he is a different animal because he was brought in with a completely different gimmick. And the gimmick necessitated that his name was a normal name. It was also his real name, right? But for the most part, when it's time to read the marquee, right? When it's time to read the card, you don't want to read, Jim Stevens versus, Steven Johnson, right? You don't want to read two regular ass names. And WWE and AEW both have fallen victim to having people with normal people names. So it's like when I say, for example, what's the difference? Like literally, what's the difference between Kip Sabian and Sammy Guevara? They're the same character. They have the same style. One is not better than the other, right? Yes, Sammy Guevara is presented as being better, but he's not better, right? There's nothing to differentiate these two jobbers from each other, right? Nathan Frazier, you can introduce, Nathan Frazier, and you're like, I have no idea what the fuck this is. It sounds boring, right? At least, foreign wrestlers benefit from this significantly, right? Because if your name is like Jinder Mahal, that sounds Indian. So you might think to yourself, well, this is WWE. Gimmicks are important. So maybe his gimmick is some sort of Indian stereotype, right? And that's fundamentally what it is. Like, he's basically this, privileged Indian guy. That's like the beginning of his gimmick, right? So the idea is, by looking at the name, I should have some indicia as to what I'm signing up for, right? If I see Cody Rhodes versus, Seth Rollins, it's like, if you turn that on, you're like, oh, I have no idea who's who. Like, if you don't know who they are, you'd be like, which one's Cody Rhodes and which one's Seth Rollins? It's just two guys wrestling, right? That's boring as hell. Like, why is this supposed to be better than two other guys wrestling in a backyard? Why, right? Now, if you turn on the TV and you see a man called the Ultimate Warrior, right? And you see a man called Hulk Hogan, or you see Hulk Hogan versus a man called Yokozuna, right? Which is not even a name, it's a rank in sumo, right? You will immediately know. You could tune in to, Yokozuna versus Hulk Hogan, and people are going to be like, you're going to hear the announcers, and then you're going to immediately pick up on who is Yokozuna and who is Hulk Hogan. Not only that, you're going to immediately pick up what their character is supposed to be, motherfucks, and that's what's important here, When you turn the TV on, I shouldn't have to start thinking about what the hell is going on in a silly, wrestling match, right? That's why this is a fact, basically, in many, many different sports leagues, right? Especially the more recent ones. The EPL, which has been around for 200 years or whatever, even they have names, like Tottenham Hotspurs, right? Like, they have a name, they have a logo, they have an identity, right? But if you watch, basketball or something, right? It's never going to be like Dallas versus, Miami, right? It's going to be the Mavericks versus the Heat. Because the Mavericks versus the Heat sounds more badass, right? You assign an identity to the teams, and you're like, oh, I'd like to see which is better, Mavericks or Heat, right? Nobody watches basketball and thinks to themselves, I wonder what city was able to put together a better basketball franchise. Is it Dallas or is it Miami? Nobody gives a shit about that, right? Nobody even associates the team with the city unless you're in that city, right? For example, if you're for example, my cousin is Canadian, right? He lives in Canada. So he started liking football when he moved to Canada, right? And I'm like, what team do you like? I think he likes Dallas or something, right? And I'm like, why? That's so random, right? He's like, there is no Toronto football team, right? So I'm gonna pick randomly, basically, right? And I'm like, what did you base it on? He's like, well, I based it on the fact that Cowboys are cool, right? Simple as that. You can get a lot of fans just from that identity, motherfucks. And it's the same thing with wrestling. This is why a lot of people try to brand themselves. And the best way to brand yourself is to have a catchy and interesting name, right? This is true for businesses. This is true for entertainment. This is true for sports. Why do you think there's so many actors that have like their name is like, you know, like Abernathy Smith III, right? And their like stage name is like John Speedston or something like that, right? You know what I mean? Like Tom Cruise is a great example. Like his last name's not Cruise, right? But he understood that his last name, which was like Mapother or something like along those lines. Like he's like, oh, that's not gonna sell tickets. I need to be Tom fucking Cruise, right? The Rock, like if he could be The Rock, he'd be The Rock, right? He had to be Dwayne Johnson for other reasons, but if he wanted to, if he had the opportunity, he would be The Rock. Batista is gonna. Well, luckily, his name is Batista, so he could be Dave Batista. It's the same shit. But you understand what I'm saying, right? A lot of people really try to get their name out there in other ways, and this was very, very tantamount in wrestling, right? Even mid-carders, even if you have like, I always use him as an example, Val Venus, right? Val Venus, if you see, like, let's say that it's going to be Val Venus versus Bull Buchanan, right? And they both come out, right? If you ask 10 people, which one of these guys do you think is Val Venus? They'd be like, oh, I'm pretty sure it's going to be the guy who talked about fucking women and gyrated his hips. Because Venus sounds like penis, and that's part of the joke. And likewise, if you ask him, like, which one of these guys looks more like a Bull Buchanan to you? They'd be like, oh, the guy that looks like a prison guard. That sounds like a prison guard, right? You see what I'm saying? People would be able to make the connections without being spoon-fed the connections. But when someone is told, oh, it's going to be Bobby Lashley versus, I don't know, Drew McIntyre, right? I mean, obviously, like, the McIntyre might give it away because one's black and one's white, but you understand what I'm saying. The point being, like, you'd be like, oh, who's who? And also, why should I care? Why should I like Bobby Lashley more than Drew McIntyre? I don't know anything about their characters. In fact, neither of them have a character at all. So it's like, I'm just going to pick one randomly. Oh, this guy did the first 3 moves well, so he's my new favorite wrestler, right? That's not how you connect to the audience. And WWE and AEW both suck for, not realizing that, and more importantly, not utilizing that to their advantage, cucks.